scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. The day started like any other at Peppa's playgroup, but something felt different from the moment she walked through the door. The classroom was unusually quiet, and all her friends were sitting perfectly still at their desks, staring straight ahead with blank expressions. Their eyes didn't blink, and their smiles were frozen in place, as if someone had painted them on their faces. Miss Rabbit stood at the front of the classroom, but her usual cheerful demeanor had been replaced by something much more sinister. Her ears drooped unnaturally, and when she spoke, her voice echoed as if it were coming from somewhere far away. She announced that today they would be playing a special game called the Quiet Game, where no one was allowed to speak or move until she said so. Peppa tried to whisper to Susie Sheep, but Susie didn't respond. When Peppa looked closer, she noticed that Susie's eyes had turned completely white, like marbles, and her wool seemed to be moving on its own, writhing and twisting as if it were alive. Pedro Pony sat next to her, but his mane had grown so long that it covered his entire face, and strange whispers seemed to be coming from beneath it. The classroom began to change around them. The colorful drawings on the walls started to move and shift, showing scenes that became increasingly disturbing. The happy sun in one picture slowly developed a frown, then sharp teeth, then began to drip what looked like black tears. The flowers in another drawing wilted and turned to ash before reforming into twisted, gnarled shapes that reached out from the paper. Miss Rabbit announced it was time for lunch, but when she opened the lunch boxes, instead of sandwiches and fruit, they contained things that shouldn't be there. Candy Cat's lunchbox was filled with actual candy that moved and squirmed like insects. Rebecca Rabbit's contained carrots that screamed when touched. George's lunchbox was completely empty, but when he looked inside, he could see his own reflection staring back at him, except the reflection was crying blood. During playtime, the toys in the classroom came to life in the most unsettling way. The building blocks rearranged themselves into impossible structures that defied gravity, floating in midair and forming shapes that hurt to look at. The toy cars drove themselves in endless circles, their tiny headlights glowing red like angry eyes. The dolls in the play corner turned their heads to watch the children, their plastic smiles never changing even as their eyes followed every movement. Peppa noticed that the clock on the wall had stopped working, its hands spinning wildly in different directions. Time seemed to stretch and compress randomly. Sometimes a minute felt like an hour, and sometimes an hour passed in what felt like seconds. The windows showed different views each time she looked. Sometimes the familiar playground, sometimes a dark forest, sometimes nothing but swirling mist. When it was time to go home, the children lined up as usual, but their parents who came to collect them weren't quite right either. Daddy Pig arrived to pick up Peppa, but he was much taller than usual, his shadow stretching impossibly long across the floor. When he spoke, his voice was deeper and seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Mummy Pig was there too, but she kept flickering like a broken television, sometimes appearing normal, sometimes appearing as just an outline filled with static. The walk home felt endless. The familiar streets seemed to stretch on forever, and the houses they passed all looked identical, as if they were walking through a maze with no exit. Street lamps flickered on even though it was still daylight, casting strange shadows that moved independently of the people who should have been casting them. The sky above them was the wrong color, not quite blue, not quite gray, but something in between that made Peppa feel dizzy when she looked up. When they finally reached home, the house looked normal from the outside, but inside, everything was slightly wrong. The furniture was in the right places, but it was all just a little bit too big or too small. The family photos on the walls showed the right people, but their expressions were different, sadder, more distant, as if they were looking at something terrible that only they could see. At dinner, the food tasted like nothing, as if it were made of cardboard and air. The conversation felt scripted, with everyone saying the right words but in voices that didn't quite match their usual tones. George kept glancing at the corner of the room where nothing was there, but he seemed to be watching something that only he could see. As bedtime approached,